Hey there everyone, welcome back to AP Psychology with me, Miss Baines, your teacher. So, as a gentle reminder, while I'm doing the talking, you should be filling in your binder notes. So go ahead and grab those multicolored flared tip pens, get yourself in a nice comfy chair, and don't forget those ever important binder notes that accompany today's video, which are Unit 2, Video 6, Psychoactive Drugs. I'll see you on the other side. Okay, so welcome back. So today we're going to talk about psychoactive drugs. As you can see in our learning targets, it's all about how drugs interact with our brains. But before we get into exactly what each of these drugs are, in chemistry terms, we're going to talk about how they actually affect us. The first thing to understand is that psychoactive drugs have to make their way up to our brain, right? And how they get to our brain and impact our brain is by breaking through what we call our blood-brain barrier. So our blood-brain barrier is a border of blood vessels in our brain, and it only allows blood from the central nervous system to get through to the peripheral nervous system. Blood is not going to be able to break through there. So for example, the blood in your arms, right? Those are part of your peripheral nervous system. And for the most part, it doesn't impact what is going on up here in your brain, okay? So the problem is some things do get through the barrier, even when the blood doesn't. And psychoactive drugs are small enough to break through that brain-blood wall barrier and to get through to the brain, which is why they affect the brain cells, okay? So, like I said, psychoactive drugs are chemical substances that when introduced into the bloodstream, either through our veins intravenously, like with a needle, or through our digestive system by taking them in either liquid or pill form orally, or even sometimes we can get it through our skin by way of little skin patches that are soaked in the drug and then stuck to your arm so that they can alter our perception or mood. They're quite literally interacting with our brain then and changing the way that the brain is working, okay? In other words, they're affecting our consciousness. They're affecting our mind, which is why they are called psycho, which is our mind, active, affecting the activity or the thoughts inside of our mind. Okay? So they break through that blood-brain barrier and they interact with our neurotransmitters at the receptor sites. Remember we talked about agonists and antagonists? So they either mimic those neurotransmitters at the receptor sites or they block incoming neurotransmitters at their receptor sites by flooding them over with outside substances such as alcohol and street drugs as well as pharmaceuticals. So, how do we become addicted to drugs? Well, first we need to build up a tolerance to them over time. Repeated exposure to psychoactive drugs creates what we call a tolerance. What that means is that if you drink more and more and more, the more that you take in of that particular alcohol or drug, your ability to feel the euphoric effects of them begins to lessen. So in order to feel the euphoria or the high, it takes a bigger dose for you to get there. For example, let's think about caffeine, which is an over-the-counter, widely available psychoactive drug, probably the most popular one in the world. We all, or many of us, use it in order to increase our alertness, in order to increase our ability to stay awake longer, increase our ability to complete jobs and tasks, right? So the first time you ever had caffeine in your life, maybe it was a soda, and it really made you hyperactive and your pupils dilated and your heart rate increased. But probably over time, as you started to drink soda more often, and the more that you ingested, the more caffeine, whether it being soda or in Coca-Cola or a Pepsi or a big chocolate bar or hot cocoa or even iced tea, which all of these are loaded with caffeine. It's also hidden in a lot of things, and so that your tolerance for caffeine has gotten higher. It takes more caffeine caffeine to make you that super alert or hyperactive, or even to feel the effects of it, okay? And that's what this is showing here. Right here, it's showing us that this is the amount of the drug that you were taking, okay, the dose, and this is the effect of it. So at the very beginning, a small dose of that drug is going to have this kind of effect right here. But over time, you're going to need a lot more and a lot more of that dosage to have a large effect on the human body. This is another way to look at it in terms of alcohol. Right? With alcohol, when we build up a tolerance to it, it takes more and more alcohol to get a person intoxicated or even to just feel tipsy. On a normal brain, you would only need a 0.10 alcohol level, which is equal to about 4 or 5 beers or glasses of wine or cocktails, right? Maybe you do 4 or 5 hard liquor shots or any other type of mixed drink. Okay, it's a rule of thumb that in 1 hour, a normal brain will begin to feel tipsy or drunk. And then if we go to 0.2 in that hour, that would double the amount. And so 10 drinks, or the equivalent of 10 ounces of liquor, into the system in that first hour. Now you're going to be having a rough night of vomiting, possibly blacking out, and depending on your tolerance, you might just slip into an actual coma. If you just add another 10 drinks, okay, 0.3 in 1 hour, you're now passed out. You're definitely going to feel numb to the effects of this amount of alcohol because you are in a coma, for sure. And you're probably even going to die at this point. And at 0.4 in 1 hour, well, not to be crude about it, but you'll be dead at a 0.425, which is 4 or 5 times the amount that your body can handle in a particular hour. Now you, a person who doesn't drink alcohol on a regular basis, would probably die with that amount, or just barely survive if you were around immediate medical assistance. You can barely survive it, however. If an alcoholic is ingesting this much, say a 0.10 blood alcohol level is going to have almost no effect on that person. They need that twice or 3 times the amount. They need more than those 5 drinks an hour to feel what they would have felt for if they were just drinking for the first time. So that's what tolerance is. So in addition to developing tolerance, we also develop a dependence on drugs and alcohol. Dependence usually means that our body actually needs that drug. It adapts to the repeated use of the drug or alcohol, meaning that we are no longer naturally producing those naturally existing neurotransmitters that are being now replaced by the drug. In most cases, so our dopamine and our serotonin and all those naturally feel-good neurotransmitters are no longer being manufactured by the brain. Remember, we talked about heroin and how that influences or changes the receptors or the naturally existing endorphins in our brain, which are our body's natural painkillers, such as oxytocin, which are in our body naturally. So we become dependent on that heroin, the human body does, to get that pain relief, and the natural endorphins will no longer be enough. So over time, this will get to the point that the withdrawal symptoms are experienced once you stop taking the drugs abruptly. There are 2 different kinds of withdrawal dependences. The first is physical dependence, and this is where our body physically needs that drug to continue to feel even just normal. Forget about getting high anymore. The body needs that drug to feel normal. And when it doesn't get the drug, the person will have withdrawal symptoms. This might include vomiting, shivering, shaking, headaches, goosebumps, bone aches, anxiety, skin crawling, and nonstop diarrhea. And that's just the first 3 days. That would be followed by several more weeks of bone chills and fevers and endless sleepless nights on the bathroom floor. Skin sensitivity so bad that even the softest cotton or cashmere feels like sandpaper against your goosebumpy skin. On a much more severe level, it's a bit like trying to quit caffeine. So say you like to drink coffee every morning and then you get another 2 cups throughout the day. right? When you go without your coffee, you're probably going to have a headache. Maybe you'll start yawning and feel tired after sleeping even 8 full hours. That is a physical dependence, okay? So there are 2 examples for you of physical addiction or dependence on alcohol, opioids, or caffeine. We also have psychological dependencies or addiction to certain substances. A psychological is going to involve those emotional feelings towards a drug. So again, let's think about coffee. If you're used to having your coffee every single morning, and it's kind of like your rest and relax time in order to recharge and start your day. If there is a time when you do not have that coffee or get that caffeine hit, you might feel sad or a little bit down in the dumps and blue or depressed. It might actually make you feel like you're missing coffee, as though you are missing a friend who passed away or is missing in your life that you haven't spoken to for a long time. For drugs that are not physically addicting, meaning one cannot be physically dependent on them or even crave them on a physical level, but in the DSM-5, the book in which psychologists use to make their diagnoses, which was last updated and released in 2015, substance abuse and substance dependence are no longer 2 different diagnoses. Okay, so in other words, abuse is when we overuse something, and then dependence is when you physically need it. So experiencing withdrawal symptoms, which doesn't always happen, is no longer necessary for us to determine, or for the psychologist to determine, that someone has a disorder, a substance abuse disorder. So what it used to say is that in order for someone to be diagnosed with substance abuse disorder, they would have to be both physically and psychologically dependent on those drugs, and they would be experiencing symptoms when they take the drug away. But not all drugs produce physical symptoms, and so they no longer have to have that as a requirement in order to determine that somebody has abuse or substance abuse disorder. It's not necessarily a necessary component of abusing drugs. Those psychological withdrawal symptoms can be just as strong. So there are a variety of symptoms that come with withdrawal, and we've talked about the physical symptoms, and then you have our psychological withdrawal symptoms. The psychological withdrawal symptoms, which again go along with the physical, are dysphoria, which is kind of like feeling a little bit out of it or disconnected in terms of you being there with your psyche, depression, anxiety, agitation, anhedonia, which is a reduced sense of feeling motivated, helplessness, and really the inability to feel good about things anymore. So it's kind of like just feeling like you're at this low, depressed level all the time. And so that's what happens when it comes to drugs and how they affect us in terms of addiction and withdrawal symptoms. Now, let's talk about the different types of drugs. We're going to talk about 3 different categories. First up are depressants, second are stimulants, and then third type are hallucinogens. Depressants are drugs that reduce our neural activity or slow our bodily functions down. These are not going to make you feel depressed. That's not what it means. By depressed, we mean in depressants, we're simply saying that we're slowing things down in the central nervous system. Okay, so depressants that slow our systems down include alcohol, barbiturates, and opiates. So let's first talk about alcohol in low doses. Alcohol relaxes the drinker so that it slows down our sympathetic nervous system. Our sympathetic nervous system, remember that? It's what activates our fight or flight. So it lowers our inhibitions and makes us do things that maybe we wouldn't have done before. They probably would have made us nervous beforehand. Maybe we would hide those feelings, and that's why people make poor sexual decisions when they're taking alcohol. Normally, a conservative person who is, say, very closed might be very selective about whom they have sexual activities with, and they hide their true sexual feelings because they want to take it slow until they fall in love with the other person in order to act on those impulses. Same thing with driving. Because it's fight-flight, is numbed out or turned off, we make stupid decisions, like getting behind the wheel of a motor vehicle and driving. Because we're not thinking straight, and our fight flight is built into our system is now depressed and numbed, and so it doesn't protect us the way that it's supposed to, in order not to hurt ourselves by getting behind the wheel or sleeping with a lot of different people. Okay, another symptom of alcohol and drug use that are depressants is that it will slow our reaction times and it will slow our speech. So now our speech is slurred and our skilled performance ability deteriorates a lot. A lot of things that are happening in your prefrontal cortex are diminished from the abuse of alcohol. It definitely affects your memory as well. So once you are no longer drunk, you don't even remember all the stupid things you may have said or done. Depressants also affect the process of turning short-term memories into long-term memories. So the recent events and experiences are no longer part of our long-term memory. So it disrupts that short-term process. It also reduces our self-awareness. So we don't really know, or we're not aware of what we're doing, and then it shifts the focus onto the immediate situation rather than all the way ahead in the future. This is why someone is going to make those really stupid decisions when they are using or under the influence of alcohol. Okay? They're thinking about, I only have to get home right now. They're not thinking about, if I get in this car right now, I could run somebody over, kill myself, or kill other people. While I'm drinking, my systems are numbed and marinating in depressants, alcohol depressants, and alcohol has a physical effect on the body, okay? It takes about 1 hour to metabolize 1 ounce of straight liquor. That's 1 shot, 1 glass of wine, 1 beer, or 1 cocktail. So what we're saying is 1 drink, it takes 1 hour to break that alcohol down and for it not to have any effect on our body at all. Women actually need more time to metabolize alcohol, and this process happens slower than in men, which has a lot to do with our muscle mass, okay? Our muscle mass in our body versus our fat levels. For example, if a woman and a man are the same weight and they consume the same amount of alcohol, the woman is going to be more impacted by the alcohol, and she's going to get drunk and intoxicated or inebriated more quickly. And they're going to stay intoxicated longer. Purely physical, because the man's body is made up of more of a muscle to fat ratio. Alcohol stays in the fat cells longer, and muscle speeds up the metabolism of alcohol. Okay, the next kind of substance that I want to discuss are barbiturates. Barbiturates, or tranquilizers, mimic the effects of alcohol, so they also depress the central nervous system activity, which is our brain and our spinal cord. And in larger doses, they can lead to impaired memory, poor judgment calls, and just a very depressed mindset. So some examples of barbiturates are Nembutal, Seconal, and Mannitol. Again, these are all tranquilizers. They are used a lot of the time to calm people down in a terrible situation if they're in a really agitated state. Okay, that could be out in the field where there's an emotionally disturbed person, or somebody witnessed something horrible, like a person getting killed or rape or something horrible like that. And they will use tranquilizers to calm the people down so that they can slowly process what they just saw and make sense of it, or what just happened to them. Next up are opiates. Opium and its derivatives are morphine and heroin. We've talked about these already and how they depress neural activity while temporarily reducing pain and anxiety. So think about morphine and what it's used for. Well, people use it when someone is in pain, right after a major surgery, or from when someone is hurt by a serious traumatic injury, like a car accident, or falling down off of a roof, or a mountain when they were engaged in some kind of extreme sport. Because of the way that these drugs mimic the neurotransmitters that relieve physical and psychic pain in our bodies, they are incredibly addictive, okay? They are so good at mimicking those oxytocin transmitters that heroin usually gives a short-lived feeling of bliss, of feeling comfortably numb and feeling like you'll be happy and blissful like that forever. Except You don't. It wears off in about an hour, and then it is followed immediately by a desperate feeling of cravings to get that pleasure again and to become comfortably numb again. But this time you need twice as much to get you there. Okay. And now you're building up a tolerance, and there's a continual need for progressively larger doses. And unless you get that hit, you're going to start feeling all of those physical and psychological withdrawal systems that I spoke of above. Because your body is no longer able to produce or rely on the endorphins that it makes on its own. Since these fake drug ones have flooded your receptors with that second master key. Methadone is often used to combat heroin addiction because although it's not quite enough to get someone who is addicted a high, right, a heroin high, it at least reduces the intense physical cravings so that you don't get sick. And so opium is in the methadone. And what it does is it kind of reduces all of those vomiting and diarrhea and horrible goosebumps systems, but it stops short of giving you that blissful high feeling. However, methadone is also very addictive, and it can stay for a long term in your spinal cord. So here are some of the long-term and short-term effects of heroin. Our central nervous system long-term effects could be addiction. Our tolerance goes down as our dependence goes up. Pneumonia in our respiratory system, infections in the heart, collapsed veins from shooting up because of constantly trying to inject the heroin into the veins of your arms, legs, fingers, and toes. You get decreased function of the liver because remember, the liver deals with flushing out any toxins. So it's overworking. And then you can get abscesses, which are infections under the skin's surface from those intravenous sites. Short-term effects, obviously, in a heroin user is going to be that they have that sense of euphoria, they're going to get that altered state of a high, and then they're going to seem really, really super drowsy because it is a depressant, so they're going to nod out, suddenly wake up, and nod out, and suddenly wake up. Everything is going to get slowed down, as well as creating a dry mouth, some warm skin, slow breathing, and depressing the respiratory system. Finally, muscular weakness. Okay, so the normal things that you could usually do, like walk up a flight of stairs, wind you. Stimulants are going to do the opposite of depressives. So they're going to excite the neural activity in your brain. They're going to speed up the bodily functions and the neural activity. So making everything that we would normally have happen in our brain speed up and go in quick motion. The first and the two most common are caffeine and nicotine. Both of these drugs, while legal, increase our heart rate, increase our breathing rates, and increase our alertness. All of our other autonomic functions are sped up. So as you recall, our autonomic functions, think autonomic nervous system, things like our heartbeat, our breathing, and our digestion, and our sweating. Well, all of those things speed up, including our metabolism. Okay, which is why we take these drugs, right? If we take caffeine in order to get alert and get our day started, to make us feel more like ourselves and on top of things, you know that it's being an overused drug again, and you build that tolerance. But this picture, though, are some long-term effects of nicotine use. So this x-ray here is showing a patient with a vaping habit using nicotine, and it's showing the long-term damage of the lung or the densities associated with the use of nicotine. Caffeine is considered one of the most widely used psychoactive drugs. Almost every person uses it in this country because it's in a lot of the food that we eat and a lot of the things that we drink, like iced tea, soda, coffee, and cocoa. It increases our alertness, which is why we drink it in the first place, and it improves our mood by mimicking the androgen neurotransmitters that are being naturally made in our brain. So our brain no longer makes those, and it gets physically addictive too. So we can experience those withdrawal systems that you get when you stop taking the caffeine. That's when the withdrawal kicks in, we get our headaches, our ability to think less sharply, we get drowsy, and just a general feeling of crabbiness because you didn't have your morning coffee. I know I get them sometimes, but in high doses, it can produce anxiety because, again, we're increasing that neural activity. And so, like, increasing all of those thoughts that are running through your head and happening in your brain. And then there's restlessness and insomnia and an increased heart rate. And so those are known as coffee nerves. They can happen over time if you keep taking a lot of caffeine on a daily basis. Amphetamines are up next. Amphetamines are referred to as speed or uppers. These suppress our appetite. At one time, they were prescribed as diet pills, but they are no longer prescribed for that because of tolerance. So what happens is you take the amphetamine one time and you immediately, the next time, you have to take a higher dose to get the same desired effect. So individuals start needing more and more and more of the drug over time to maintain that effect of suppressing the appetite. It also increases our concentration and focus. It reduces our fatigue. That's why half the country wants to go on Adderall, right? We want to work harder, work longer, and focus sharply, and that can help us to do so. However, if you are on that drug, like Adderall, regularly, it will increase your anxiety and your irritability as well. Now, methamphetamines wreak total havoc on the human brain. Crystal meth, for example, is the street drug, and it is manufactured in homemade labs where the product is either smoked or injected. If you've ever seen the series about the high school chemistry teacher who sets up a meth lab and starts selling meth, you know what I mean. After using them for a long time, you will crash because you're on this kind of fast-paced high and everything is kind of built up and exciting. And then after you use it, well, it just stops. And the withdrawal systems include things like being really, really tired, and then you sleep for hours and hours on end, and then you're in this intense and constant depressed mood. You're extremely depressed appetite, so you don't want to eat for long periods of time, and it is highly, disgustingly addictive. The after effects of using it are irritability, insomnia, hypertension, seizures, disorientation, occasional violence over time. It appears to reduce or lower the baseline dopamine levels. So remember, our dopamine is used for feeling pleasure. That's our pleasure neurotransmitter. So if these baselines are lowered, it means that we have a lower feeling of pleasure in our body at all times. And so this can leave users with a permanently depressed functioning of those neurotransmitters. The receptor sites are screwed. And again, this is functioning not as a depressed mood, okay? So slow down functioning of the body, not depressed, slow down functioning of the body. Cocaine is also a stimulant. It's used today in anesthetics such as Novocaine, which is used often, especially in dental work. Cocaine was originally in Coca-Cola. It's not a myth. It actually was an ingredient in Coca-Cola as a pick-me-up beverage. However, in 1903, it was replaced by caffeine because it has similar effects, but it's not as severe. However, there still are cola drinks that use the cocoa leaves in order to get that same flavoring of the cocaine. Okay, cocaine can be inhaled or snorted, usually through the nose, and some people smoke it, and that's called crack cocaine. It reaches the brain-blood barrier within 2 to 3 minutes, and I want you to think about where a person ingests it, in their nose. So if they're snorting it through their nose, they're putting it way up, giving it direct access to the brainstem, right? Your sinuses are behind your nose and then your brainstem. And so it gives an intense, quick euphoria or an intense feeling of pleasure and mental alertness and self-confidence that lasts for several minutes. Usually 10 to 30 minutes. If someone is a binge user, what cocaine does is it actually starts to block the reuptake of the dopamine. Basically, your brain is flooded with dopamine and pleasure for that moment, and that neurotransmitter that is normally made by your body is no longer being made. So this euphoria is only short-lived because you're on that drug. The brain will no longer manufacture dopamine naturally at an excelled rate, right? So if you're doing cocaine for years and years and years, your body shuts down. So some of the side effects include increased risk of strokes, which is like a brain bleed, cardiac arrest, which is a heart attack, insatiable hunger, hypersomnia, lethargy, fever, a clear stream of discharge from your nose, and you might have some throat soreness because you're inhaling foreign substances. Your teeth are beginning to wear away, you're having chest pain, possible breathing issues, asthma, bronchitis, and a lot of issues in your lungs. And then you could have a heart infection or even get skin scabs. Ecstasy is another stimulant. It's often referred to as MDMA or Molly. Ecstasy is a mild hallucinogen as well, but mainly it's a stimulant. It increases our feelings of empathy. You feel peaceful and calm and relaxed, but you also have an unending supply of energy, dancing and having fun, but you also have this really, really intense supply of energy, which is why it's a popular club drug, because it brings people together emotionally and it makes people feel close to one another while giving them a lot of energy to dance and party all night long. This is a really dangerous drug. It really is. People say that it's no big deal. It's super dangerous. It has immediate dehydrating effect, so it takes a lot of water out of your body. And if you use it and you're in the club and you're sweating a lot and there's a lot of physical activity such as dancing and, well, sexual activity, a person can risk severe overheating and passing out. This becomes especially dangerous when used along with alcohol. If a person doesn't get properly hydrated and drink plenty of water while on this drug, there can be increased blood pressure that leads to potential death. Death will ensue over time in just a few hours if the body doesn't get enough water. Researchers have found that ecstasy gives a sharp decline in memory and performance, as well as when a person is given an IQ test. Their IQ drops significantly. When people take ecstasy repeatedly, they believe that the MDA causes long-term serotonin changes. Remember, serotonin is another neurotransmitter associated with our memory, and they believe that it could lead to a reduced level of serotonin, which we could then lead to long-term memory problems and an increased risk of a depressed mood all the time. So those few hours of partying and feeling good, are they really worth not having a memory anymore? Okay, our final drugs are known as hallucinogens. Hallucinogens are psychedelics, which are the mind-manifesting drug. They distort reality, and the person who is on them's perceptions and evoke sensory images in the absence of sensory input. In other words, you're hallucinating. You may see and hear things that really aren't there. Okay, so hallucinations can be any sensory input. It can be seeing things, hearing things, tasting things, smelling something funny, feeling things, or feeling bugs crawling on your skin, or anything like that can be a hallucinogen, as long as it's not actually there in reality. We're going to talk about LSD, or acid. It's one of the most powerful drugs known to man. It only takes 1/1,000,000th of an ounce to have any sort of altering effect on the human brain. LSD was actually produced by accident by a chemist when he was accidentally ingesting fumes, minuscule amounts of the substance that makes LSD make you trip out. And he had the first ever LSD trip. When someone is on LSD, we say that they're on a trip because they actually, physically are feeling as though they are living and functioning outside of their mind in a whole new world. It usually lasts between 6 and 14 hours. It's a very long change in your central nervous system. Your brain and your spinal cord can be messed up in a permanent way, even from only doing it a couple of times. Like I said, there are visual distortions, so we may not be able to see clearly. Those hallucinations are going to happen with every sensory input. So what you see, smell, taste, hear, and touch, all of those things are going to be amplified but distorted at the same time. And some people will have unstable thoughts. People can have these things called bad trips, which would be kind of like having a nightmare for 6 to 14 hours long. So they're usually in a state of panic Okay, so then people have flashbacks from those bad trips from LSD, which means that they could have a reoccurrence of feeling whatever they were tripping out badly about weeks or months after using the drug. And lastly, we have marijuana. Marijuana, which has just become legal in New York for medicinal purposes, produces a feeling of relaxation. It relieves our inhibitions, it relieves anxiety, and then eventually increases our anxiety. It makes our sights, sounds, and touches, our emotions, and our senses really, really super intense. The THC is the main ingredient in marijuana that produces the high, and it remains in our body for a very long time. So long term, it's going to impair your attention and your coordination, it's going to slow down our reaction time, and it's going to interfere with our concentration and logical thinking. It's going to impair our ability to form new memories. A chronic use of marijuana can lead to a chronic loss of motivation and general feelings of apathy, or what we call indifference, which means like you develop this attitude of, whatever, what do I care? It doesn't affect me. For the influence of drugs like marijuana on us, we can use the biopsychosocial lens. We have biological influences, which could be genetic tendencies that lead us to use drugs. There's literally a heroin gene that we either have or we don't have that predisposes us to getting addicted when we use opioids after surgery, for example, right? If our dopamine reward circuitry is even slightly out of whack or unbalanced due to our lifestyle choices that we make, say eating junk food all the time with disproportionate amounts of sugar and flour and saturated fat, and then we have psychological influences, which could be peer pressure or social cultural customs. Psychological would be how you process your information, right? Your stress levels. And then those disorders, anxiety or depression, and people often self-medicate these symptoms with drugs or alcohol. The biggest influence, though, on what you experience when you take drugs is actually your expectation of what you expect to happen when you take the drug, okay? Those expectations are based on past experiences or other people telling you what you're going to experience honestly when you take them. It is a huge influence on what happens to you when you consume that drug, right? It's mind over matter. If somebody says this will happen, it's going to happen, and it's going to be amplified. Okay, that's what I have for you today on psychedelic drugs and the human brain, and that you learned and that you are prepared to answer the questions that will come up on the AP psychology exam about psychedelics. Bye now.